so pleased to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Professor Jean McLain. She is the Assistant Dean of the Faculty Advancement Department at the University of Arizona. Professor McLain is also a research specialist. Her areas of research focus on wastewater reuse and water quality chemistry and microbial ecology for arid and semi arid agriculture. Her extension and outreach focus on culturally relevant food safety for Native tribes.
Good morning.
Yes, good morning to you too. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us.
Of course.
So,
Dr. Jean, would you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Jean McLain. I am a research scientist at the University of Arizona. And what I do is examine antibiotic resistance from the perspective of the environment, mostly using soil and water, but water is generally the model that I follow. And the purpose of this is to complete the One Health model, since water connects humans and animals and the environment. I use methods that range from molecular, PCR, metagenomics, looking for genes in environmental samples, but I also use a lot of cultural work. And this is something that there's increasing awareness that even though we've gone a long way with our development of these molecular methods, we still have to figure out, are these bacteria living? Just finding DNA in the environment is not a big deal unless you know that's connected to an organism that can actually replicate itself. And so these cultural methods, which basically getting a petri dish and growing the bacterium up and exposing it to antibiotics, they're becoming increasingly recognized as an important part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I've heard. So I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Bing Wang here. She's in like food science, but she's doing risk assessments. And
Okay.
she always tells us about, DNA is not enough. We need to know what's
Yeah.
actually alive if we want to
Oh,
know.
good.
It's kind of like this conundrum where you said multiple times in your presentation, we need standard methods. And I guess I'm just curious, as somebody who probably knows more about how that discussion is going than any of us are, is like, what is the sense of what those standard methods might look like, and where we are in terms of getting some kind of buy-in or requirements from funding agencies to do them.
Yeah, so there was a very impactful paper put out by Amy Prudden's lab. So Amy Prudden is like worldwide known for her research in antimicrobial resistance. She's at Virginia Tech University, and she, working with Jody Harwood at South Florida University, did a large study on. What they did is they gathered the literature from the last 15 years and looked at all these targets that are being studied in the environment, in clinical, in animals, and they really thousands of publications to identify the ones that were most impactful, that were providing the strongest information. And they had a very good paper in Environmental Science and Technology just last year. It's been extremely well received. It's been discussed at antibiotic resistance meetings. As far as the buy-in of funding agencies, Mara, you've hit the nail on the head. That's what we need. Because if researchers are stubborn, we're all a little bit arrogant, and we're stubborn, and we really like our methods. But being told by the funding agencies, we want you to focus on these 5 organisms and these 25 genes and culturing, that would be so helpful, because of course we all revolve around where we're going to get our next level of funding. I know that the Water Reuse Foundation, which is a big funder, they are buying into this, but beyond that, the big ones, USDA being big one, National Institutes of Health and NSF, I really don't know where the conversation is there. But there is increasing recognition that we need to continue this conversation to include the funding agencies.
Yeah. I'm sorry I got us a little off track
No,
there,
it's
but I just
okay.
feel like that's
No,
No,
really
great
good.
question.
Yeah.
all right. Go ahead.
So
Sorry.
we can go into the next one. So all of us hosts here have told the story of when they first heard about antimicrobial resistance. Some people have a pretty interesting story attached to it. Some of us can't remember where we heard about it first. So it all depends on our lives. I didn't hear about it until I was in my 30s, whereas Mara can't even remember the first time she heard about it. So do you have any stories? Can you remember the first time you heard about it?
I do. So I started my research at the USDA in 2002. And at the time, Arizona was becoming increasingly dependent on recycled wastewater. And we were hearing a lot more about, what's entering the environment with the recycled wastewater. There was a lot of negativity back then about, are we poisoning ourselves? And a couple of very impactful papers appeared in the literature, and I was very much swayed to start my research into recycled water, which is what I was tasked with at the USDA. So I thought antibiotic resistance sounds like the way to go. Then, yeah, this is still a little bit hard to talk about. In 2014, my father went into the hospital for some routine surgery. He was having some gastrointestinal problems. And he was very healthy in his early 70s, and he never came home. He
Mm.
eventually died of sepsis about 3 weeks later.
I'm
And
sorry.
so, yeah, you know, it was such a horrific thing to watch. You know, I've looked at this from the environmental perspective, but at arm's length. And here I was at his bedside, watching these really competent doctors doing everything they could to save this man, and there was nothing they could do. And it gave me such an understanding of what the clinicians are dealing with, which I had not really considered before. But that's when I truly entered into this One Health perspective. I think of my father so often. I think of him every day. And whenever I make a finding in antibiotic resistance, I wish I could have done it years earlier and maybe helped him. So um, we lost my father the 2 weeks before I hosted a international antibiotic resistance meeting in Arizona, where we had researchers from all over the world coming together to talk about this problem. And so I getting up to tell that story in front of this group was I don't think there was a dry eye in the house. I think that a lot of us have dealt with it from a very personal perspective, and that's when everything became so much more personal for me, obviously.
Mhm. Well, thank you for sharing that, even though it was tough still to talk about.
Yeah.
So,
And actually, I mean, not even the first person that we've interviewed for this podcast who's working in this space was working in it before, and then as someone they loved, face the challenge. And that combination is just, it shows how important the work is. So it's
Yeah.
affirming, but it's also, I'm sure, a kind of a heavier load in a sense. So
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. I think that one of the hardest, well, no, I can't say one of the hardest, but one very frustrating thing was that my mother, who was also at the bedside of my dad, was looking to me like, about this. What can you do? And really, this bug that killed my father, there was nothing that they could do. And probably still, even nearly 10 years later, there's probably nothing that they could have done about that particular infection.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing
Or,
that.
or
Yeah. Um, we can go into our next one, I guess. So this is kind of a shift, a more I guess fun question. In your career as a research scientist, you've explored a lot of various topics. And but if you could jump back into research with 10 times the budget and time you have now, what area of research into AMR would you choose to pursue?
that is such a great question. And I've thought about this a lot because I'm at a point in my career where I am kind of turning everything over to my former students as they examine these great pressing problems. And so I'm trying to guide them to do things that are of more interest to me. So I think that if I were starting now, I would do far more metagenomic work. So most of my research has been looking for individual genes using molecular methods, looking for individual antibiotic resistance genes. But the metagenomics, the fact that the price for metagenomic data has fallen so substantially, it used to be $1,000 a sample. That was hard to deal with. Now it's just a mere fraction of that, and it gives us so much information about the genes that are there. And looking at antibiotic resistance from this metagenomic perspective, which shows us all the genes, we can get a much better answer when we compare it to our culturing results. So we know exactly which genes are there and how this corresponds to the results that we get when we culture the bacteria. So I would have loved to have had more access to metagenomics data. There is also some really exciting work going on right now, actually at the University of Arizona, looking at C. diff. So C. diff being a really terrible gut bacteria that is so devastating to human beings. But there is a researcher there, a close friend of mine, who's looking at bacterial communication and how this can actually be used to start addressing things like antibiotic resistance. So it's actually what she's developing is a new alternative to traditional antibiotics, because the bacteria they've shown us, we don't care what you develop, we're going to overcome it. You can throw everything you want to in the world at us and give us a couple generations and we're going to be through that. Well, this researcher's name is Gayatri Vedantam, and she is just looking at really unique pathways to study this transition of antibiotic resistance with C. diff. She's looking more from a clinical realm, but her work is so exciting. She put me on her expert guidance panel, and I'm just thrilled to be there because this is something that is completely new to me. I can't really go into the specifics of exactly what she's looking at, but it's not developing a new chemical to throw at these antibiotics. It's actually using some of their natural processes against them. And it shows an awful lot of promise.
That's good. It's always exciting to hear. So many new developments always happening. It
Yeah,
always can give a lot
sure.
of hope. You'll get
Yeah,
as many times as you hear more resistance found here and here and here, and this is such a huge problem. As every time that you come out with an article like that, you also hear someone has found a new potential way. So
yeah,
that's always encouraging.
yeah.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
mother had C. diff and it was
Oh,
awful.
oh,
So that's really interesting to me to hear that she's working on that. So
yeah, yeah. So has she recovered, Amber? I hope.
she has, but there's still symptoms
Yeah,
and she still has side effects from it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so incredibly debilitating. And so
Yeah.
we have a lot of research going on C. diff in particular at the University of Arizona. So,
Yeah. She has chronic UTIs and she's
oh,
constantly on some kind of antibiotic and she has a
yeah,
lot of health issues. So,
mhm,
um, but I think that's probably where the C. diff started was from all
yeah,
the antibiotics she had been prescribed from the
for sure,
UTIs. So,
sure. Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
God. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Oh, thank you.
It's also scary because, there's not UTIs are one of the ones that there's not as many antibiotics are still working for. The antibiotics are starting to run out for that. So hopefully,
Yeah, I think UTIs were a big cause of a lot of this resistance development because really all women and a lot of men get them and they prescribe the antibiotics and so the whatever was causing the UTI, the E. coli or whatever, quickly was able to develop resistance. And so
yeah,
mhm, yeah.
yeah.
I did have a question, although we were talking about new technologies, new research that's coming up. Um, I was kind of interested in the research you've done within wetlands and then just like in general in wastewater treatment. And I'm kind of curious in terms of what you've identified as maybe things that will work, because you found that the wetland was maybe more effective than this control
Right.
system, but like other wastewater treatment systems that might be knocking down some of the numbers based
Mhm.
on your research.
Yeah. Well, with the movement of many areas of the world to this direct potable reuse, where they're actually cleaning the water to the point where it can leave the treatment plant and people can drink it right away. So these new methods with which contain many steps of disinfection um, do have the ability to reduce the bacteria leaving the treatment plant to near zero numbers. The resistance genes then are still a concern because when you clean wastewater, or one of the first steps is you might take something like UV light and that blasts the bacteria to pieces, releasing the DNA. So the water leaving the treatment plant is still filled with DNA. Big question. Are these genes in and of themselves a problem? Can we put raw DNA, naked, I think it's called naked DNA, into the environment and will bacteria take it up? And that still remains a question. I think some researchers have shown that it can happen. It's very rare, but if it can happen, that's a concern because how much DNA we're releasing to the environment, not just through the wastewater, but also through the manures after composting, which the biosolids and manures are supposed to go through. The levels of bacteria should be way down, but that DNA probably remains. So, is that an area that needs to be researched far more? Yes, absolutely.
Maybe there's
Always the
also,
question. More research is the
yeah, always the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Because also when you're thinking about the DNA in the environment, since you said it might, of course, more research, but if it's not like if it can happen sometimes, but this doesn't happen often, you could ask, so which would be better to just turn it into DNA, to just blast it with the UV rays and compare to just leaving it as it was before. So,
Mhm.
of course, I suppose there's the expense. Are we
Yeah,
going to do all
yeah,
this? Is it worth it?
right.
Oh,
Yeah, so it's very clear that if you're comparing the naked DNA to an actual viable bacterium that could be released, the DNA is far less of an issue. The viable bacterium could immediately be taken up by a human or an animal and cause problems. But that doesn't mean that the naked DNA is not still a problem. It's comparatively less of a problem. Now, right now, as far as I'm aware, and I may be wrong because technology is moving so fast. I don't believe that we've developed methods for removing DNA fragments from this water. It is probably an area that's being worked on, and they may have made headway in that area. If that's something they're working on, that's great. That's something that's very much needed.
So, I mean, and we'll still do research for this part, but even on your research, it had less antimicrobial resistance in the recycled wastewater. I
Right,
mean, the
right.
recycled versus the just the natural wastewater.
Yeah,
Maybe even that water, even without further treatment, is still better use than
yeah,
what we would get from, say, groundwater or something.
yeah, we would
Oh,
hope so. And I think that seems to be the case. That's what we're finding.
I just find it so interesting that the possible solution, your hypothesis was that maybe they would release naturally the DNA. They didn't need those resistant
Right.
strands anymore, and they were just getting rid of it. And the possibilities that opens up, because usually when you think about antibiotic resistance, you're thinking about how can we get to the point we can kill these superbugs,
Hmm.
But what if you could just get them to naturally release a bunch of
Right,
that and just make themselves not superbugs
right.
anymore. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing if
yeah.
we could? So you've probably had other people talking about this horizontal gene transfer. So that's kind of what I was talking about, the fact that a bacterium can release a gene that is then taken up by another bacterium. And that's the way antibiotic resistance very often is passed from one bacterial group to a next. But what if the second bacterial group doesn't want that gene? Well, they're not going to take it up and the DNA degrades and everyone's happy. But
Mm.
yeah, great area for research.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
Maybe
Yeah.
we just need to add an incubation step where we give them all of the food that they want
right,
and
right.
then come back and kill them.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how that would work with the clinical like human science. Let's feed them
yeah,
first and then kill
yeah.
them.
And of course, this finding that I had at the wetland was after 20 years of wastewater application. So it's not something,
Mhm.
I don't know if we could actually force it to happen in the lab. It's something that happened over probably many millions of generations of these bacteria.
Mm.
But still, it's so interesting that if I had not run into that researcher from Israel, I may have just called this a failed research study and
Mm.
never tried to publish it. But having that conversation with Dr. Eddie Citrian is at the Volcani Institute in Israel, and we were both confounded by our findings and just yeah coming to agreement as to with a strong hypothesis was really valuable.
Mhm. That sounds like it'd be a very exciting meeting, though. Here you were thinking, oh man, it was just a failure. Then,
Right, yeah,
whoa, it's not.
yes, absolutely.
Okay, so what do you see as the biggest challenge the fight against antimicrobial resistance faces today?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think the biggest challenge is there are two. One is governmental buy-in, meaning so the United States and the European Union years ago began passing laws or guidelines for the agricultural community years ago, where they can no longer add these antibiotics to cattle, chickens. They were being used for weight gain, and that was so that has now been outlawed in the U.S. and the European Union. Um, we were making really strong progress in the clinical realm as far as correct prescription. It's being taught in all of the medical schools. For years, you would get a doctor who would prescribe an antibiotic for a cold, you know, because the mother demanded it or something. Well, that had really stopped quite a bit. And then what happened? COVID. So COVID has resulted in a large increases in reports of antibiotic resistance. The clinicians were desperate to find, to number one, to find cures for COVID, but then the COVID sufferers were developing these horrific respiratory diseases. Antibiotics were being prescribed at far, far higher rates. And there is evidence that we have slipped back in the development of antibiotic resistance, that it was definitely starting to decrease in the US and European Union. And I don't believe it is any longer. But another issue outside of the US and the European Union are other countries. For example, Asia is the site of a lot of antibiotic manufacture, and the guidelines are quite lax. There are major studies ongoing right now in bodies of water outside of manufacturing facilities in India. I don't want to target India as the problem, but there's a reason why they do so much manufacture in these countries, because the guidelines are far more relaxed. And these studies that have been done in these bodies of waters have found really, really horrifically high levels of unmetabolized antibiotics that are being dumped into these water bodies. Big problem. Then you've got some developing countries. So I'll give you a scenario from Africa where you have someone who may have 4 or 5 cattle to support their family. They need this cattle maybe as a food source, maybe they're using it as a source of dairy, and this animal comes down with an infection. They are able to get an antibiotic for that animal, and they need to. It's keeping their family alive. But they're sold pretty much over the counter. They don't know what infection this animal has, but they just know that they can get an antibiotic to control it. How are you going to tell this person, no, you can't use these antibiotics because you haven't cultured the causative agent? You can't do that. I mean, these animals are keeping people alive. And so, we are fortunate in the United States to be at a point where we can mandate certain guidelines. But in a large areas of the world, we're just not at that point yet. Big challenge there.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked about some of those things before, so I'm thankful that you you said them as well.
I'm actually
Uh,
I'm actually wondering because I know Beth told us that you had done some work on like environmental justice and some of the more disadvantaged populations here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of wondering, I don't know if you did any work on AMR specifically in that context, but like, do you see a lot of the same stories and challenges even in the US in some of the poor or marginalized communities in terms of access to good medicine or need to use like fish from the river or desperate, to use antibiotics in their animals or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
case may be. The story could be different
Yeah.
within the United States, just generally.
Right. That's an excellent question, and very, very relevant to what I've been talking about. So a large study that I conducted a few years ago looked at the flows of wastewater into Arizona from Mexico. So Mexico does not have the same guidance as far as cleanliness of their water before it's released into the environment. And we do have at least one river that flows northward into Arizona. And Arizona has developed international wastewater treatment plants that can treat this water before it causes problems in Arizona. But you've got the border communities. So border communities, and generalizing here, but they're underserved on both sides, on the US side as well as Mexico. And so you have people exposed to this water. They may be using it for irrigation, they may be using it even recreationally. And so they're exposed to far higher levels of all kinds of contaminants. It's not just the antibiotics. And so this study that I was conducting, we also pulled in an epidemiologist to collect data from those border communities. Does this actually translate to higher levels of reported resistance? And at first pass, we weren't really finding that, but this is a very limited study, just starting to look at the problem. And you did, Mara, you hit on the question. I mean, we're very fortunate that we do have the modern medical care, but not everybody has it. And does this cause issues from the antibiotic resistance realm? My gut tells me yes, it absolutely does. I think that somebody who does not have health insurance may be less, is not going to want to go to the doctor if they develop a terrible diarrhea, for example. I mean, they may just wait to get over it. They may not have the access to the medical services or the money to pay for it. And so does this put them at a disadvantage? Absolutely, it would.
What is one thing you wish people knew about antimicrobial resistance?
I just love this question. I mean, there are so many things, but I've spent the last hour or so talking about a lot of doom and gloom, right? Almost to the point where someone could say, well, we're just doomed. And I have heard people actually say that. But I think that the experience that we had in the US and Europe, when we did start to really put more guidance for the clinicians, guidance for the farmers, guidance for the wastewater treatment plant operators, we started putting that in place. We started to make a difference. We really did. And I think that that is a really good lesson to everyone that, yeah, we've got a very serious problem, one that affects every person on the face of the earth, probably, but there's hope. We've got the brightest, I like to say, the brightest minds in the world working on this problem. And so I think that what we've seen in the US and Europe, where we started turning it around a little bit, is something that people should know, that it's not hopeless. In fact, it's the other way around, that there's a lot of hope. And, as I've been saying, working together, the clinicians, the agricultural producers, the environmental scientists, working together is going to bring about change
Mhm.
if we can do it, and if COVID doesn't come back again. Oh, yeah.
This needs to be the focus. COVID, don't come
Yeah,
back. You've
that
had
was
your day.
so it was so disheartening when the
Yeah.
CDC released that data
Mhm.
that we were starting to slip back, because everyone was really just so thrilled that look at we're
Yeah.
starting to see a little bit of a turnaround. And
Uh-huh.
oh boy.
But it's a good message to know. Don't give up now. People are becoming more and more aware. It may be a
Yeah,
slow start, but we're going to get there eventually. I mean, we have to. I mean, there's no
yeah,
other choice. So,
I was thinking about, in terms of what people should know about AMR. And I mean, that's kind of how we got started on doing this podcast. But one of the things we identified that people should understand is, like you're saying, how it's being worked on, a little bit more optimistic viewpoint. And one of the things we've tried to talk about through the series is the process of science. It's slow, but it's sort of sure and iterative. And your story about um the wastewater in the wetland thing was
Yeah.
actually really well illustrative of that, because, you got to this point where you didn't understand it, but that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that it's over. The questions
Right.
continue, and then someone's going to be working on solving that problem in the
Mhm.
future. And like, yes, it seems for like probably the public, they're not as aware of all of these individual iterative papers. They only see
Yeah.
when the solution is published in public media, but it's an illustration of how the work continues, and that we're never giving up, and we'll get there
Yeah.
slowly but surely. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well said. Well said. Never giving up.
A lot of times you'll see like the sensationalized stories, or like this is a serious problem. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And that's the ones that are most often published in something that someone's going to see. Whereas the things where a new possible solution, another one of the pieces of the puzzle to possibly solving
Mhm.
this problem is maybe not something they're going to see as much because it's still getting
Yeah.
researched or whatnot. And
Right.
so those that know about AMR but not are that deep into it, but those that are aware of it may feel, if they only see the sensationalized stuff, may feel hopeless. And
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
not, well, you have them to throw the towel in. There is still hope.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, you're right. If you've got doom and gloom to report, that sells newspapers, doesn't it?
Mm,
But if you've got, yeah, we figured out that this is not happening, or only happens under certain conditions or whatever, the public probably is not that receptive to that
mhm.
message. So even though it's very important.
Yeah. We're kind of on the awareness side, getting out the awareness as well. And I always think about AMR and climate change as being very good reflections of each other, as far as
Mhm.
like the world effort that's needed, and also just the way they're looked at. They can be looked at as a very like distressing, like there's nothing we can do. But then when you see so many people have gotten involved in climate change,
Oh yeah.
they are going to fix this.
Yeah.
And the awareness of it is so is so widespread. And I doubt there's anybody that you talk to that has not heard about what climate change is. And that's where we need to get with AMR.
Where's the picture from? Where we need to get there?
Oh, you mean my T-Rex?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the T-Rex is our front yard.
Oh my
Wow.
goodness.
Yeah, so the first year of COVID, I don't know if you remember that first Christmas, COVID. Oh, how like the whole world was so dark. And my husband and I don't really buy each other Christmas gifts. We've got everything we want. But we were passing by a garden store, and they had these dinosaurs that this one's about 10 or 12 feet high. And we looked at each other at the same time and said, we need a dinosaur. So we do make, we dress him up sometimes for holidays. We do make little political statements by like dangling certain political figures off his front teeth and things like that.
Oh
Yeah, so
wow.
he's rather well known and good. And yeah, we just love having him. So